suppose we could start now. Good evening. Thanks so much for coming. I know there's a lot of things going on tonight, so I'm very grateful for your presence here tonight at the art opening and for our talk. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jara Patrick, and I work as curator and gallery director here at the La Warsaw Gallery at McAllister College. And for this evening's event, we'll get to know both of our visiting artists who are here with us tonight for Dark Ocean, and get to know their practices a little bit more. I'll do introductions, we'll talk a bit about their studio practice, and then we'll open up for some questions to the audience. As we do, just make sure that you raise your hand and get a microphone, because tonight's talk is recorded, so if you have a question, we'd love to capture that on our recording. So just be sure to raise your hand and wait for a mic. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome our visiting guests. This is Perry Bard, and this is Hakan Topal. Both are visiting us from New York this evening. Hakan was born in Turkey and is an artist living and working in Brooklyn. He is assistant professor of new media and art and design at Purchase College, and was a graduate faculty at the School of Visual Arts Fine Art Department. He's the co-founder of the international art collective Ex-Urban Collective, and exhibited in both the 8th and 9th Istanbul Biennials, at Apex Art in New York, and also at the 49th Venice Biennale for the Turkish Pavilion. His texts have been featured in various international journals, books, and catalogs, and he is the co-editor and publisher of The Sea Image, Visual Manifestations of Port Cities and Global Waters. And next to me is Perry Bard. Perry, since moving to New York in 1983, Perry has made work fueled by observations of her immediate environment and their interpretations in a global context. She has shown her work internationally at the New York Museum of Modern Art, PS1, at Scanners Video Festival, Lincoln Center, and also most recently at the Carta Dega Biennial. And this project was also produced in collaboration with her co-partner, Richard Sullivan, who is somewhere in the audience. Richard was also a collaborator for the project on view in the gallery, so I want to make sure to recognize Richard as well. So thank you both for being here. I think for tonight's conversation, we can think about this as like a live studio visit. I'm familiar with these artists' practices, but this is the first time I've gotten to meet them in person myself. So we'll do something interesting tonight and just open this up as a casual conversation to learn a bit more about what you're doing, to learn about some of the work that we're seeing in the gallery tonight, as right from the artists' mouths. So I think to start off, I'd love to hear from you, Perry. I'd like to hear how Dry Heat came together. How did that project, if you're familiar with Dry Heat, it was the dual video screens in the back of the gallery. And yeah, tell me a bit about how did you meet Amber and Elan?
So this was Richard's idea. We have friends who live in California. They have 2 children. Both of them are married. They both live in Israel. One of them lives in a settlement where he chose to raise his children, and the other one works in an ecological program whose motto is "Nature knows no borders." And so the 2 of them represent opposing perspectives on Israeli politics, and we thought it would be interesting to go there and interview the 2 of them. My own interest in this is that I'm curious about how people who have opposing points of view get along. This is true in my own family as well, and it's probably true in many families that you have politics on one side and you have relatives that have politics on the other side. And how do we manage to control these kinds of relationships? And so that was the initial thought in going to Israel and interviewing these 2 people. When we got there, Elan put a lot of restrictions on what we could do. He is the one who lives in the settlement, and he didn't want the work contextualized in any way. It could never be put on the internet. And because we had gone over there in order to interview the 2 of them and see what we could do with this, we decided to just go ahead with it. And the result of that was that we framed their faces so close that if their heads dropped down when they were speaking, their lips would be out of frame. But it was a necessity given the restrictions that were put on us. It was altogether a very interesting experience because we had a residency in Israel that was run by two Argentinians who had the idea that the residency should contain people with all kinds of political perspectives. And so the woman who worked at the desk was somebody who had grown up in a settlement. She was quite conservative. There was a sound person who was Israeli in love with an Arab woman, and they were both going to move to the US because that wasn't accepted by either of their families. The couple that ran the place were going out and protesting against Arab housing that was being torn down. So it was very educational for us just being there without asking any questions. We were kind of immersed in the range of politics that existed.
And what were some of your impressions of Israel, of the area prior to going there? Did you have, what was your knowledge base, or what could and should our knowledge base be of the Israeli Palestinian conflict in order to sort of better understand your work? And
well, from my perspective, I never would have chosen to go there because I disapprove of the American position on Israel, the fact that there is genocide going on in Gaza. So I went there with an open mind, but we had a very specific way of looking at this, and so I tried to focus more. It changed my idea of what it's like to live in a war zone, let's say, because people who are living there are facing this kind of terrorism every day, although we seem to be facing it a lot in the US now as well, and globally. So I hadn't imagined that reaction, but also I had no expectations when I went there. I went there completely open to see what I might see. I don't know if that answers your question.
I'd be curious, beyond the restrictions that Elan put on your interview process, how did your experience of the place impact the project, maybe in an unpredictable way? Or, I mean, it sounds like it could entirely, but I'm wondering if there's some anecdotes you'd like to share.
Well, it determined the project in the sense that we decided to go ahead with these two interviews, and we weren't going to throw in any landscape imagery or other kinds of things because that would be a determining factors. The settlements are all on top of hills. The buildings all look the same. If we were to show a settlement, that would be making a statement. So it really determined everything that we did in relation to that. In terms of being there, I found it fascinating. Like I said, it was never my desire to go there, but just understanding what people were living with or trying to understand. For example, this couple that was now moving to the US to be able to be together and to be able to have these different perspectives on the situation was quite educational.
It's interesting that you talk about sort of, I would say even editing out, or you really concealed the entire landscape and surrounds that in many ways would portray that area maybe cinematically or the same way that like news media would handle it, and kind of came out and said that in a very cheeky kind of way in the piece that loops behind their interviews, where you're saying, we will not show you chain link fences, we will not show you, there will be no, automatic weapons, none of this. Can you talk about how the complementary text piece came about?
So after we came back from Israel, we had an opportunity to show the work in the Berlin Biennial, but they wanted to put the piece online, and we had agreed never to do that. So we had to reject that opportunity. And at the same time, the flotilla had just happened, where a ship from Turkey had arrived in Israel, to bring supplies to Israel, and this created a big uproar in Israel at the time that we were there. And I just didn't feel comfortable, or we didn't feel comfortable showing the work, which dealt simply with Israel while all of this other stuff was going on. And then when Trump came to town, we had this idea, because it all seems so absurd, the way we're absorbing the media and what's showing up in the media, and how the president communicates by 140 characters, or 180, is it? Well, it's going to be 280 anyway. We just decided to pull together a text video. Partially this had to do with the space that we were showing it in. We couldn't have two audios running at the same time, and so the solution to that was to create a text animation that was silent, that would run while the other person was speaking, and to alternate them so that we didn't have this sound problem. And in doing that, this was really a true collaboration between Richard and I, in that we both pulled from our resources. I had studied French literature before I got an MFA, and I was interested in theater of the absurd and King Ubu, and I was also reading Jonathan Crary 24/7 Capitalism and the End of Sleep, and Richard's background is as a filmmaker, so a lot of the other references in there came from his background, and we pulled this thing together pretty spontaneously.
And for those of you who might not be aware of like the theater of absurd and King Ubu, do you want to share a bit about that character and how he might parallel a certain administration? Well said, well said.
Really?
So I'll pop over to Hakan now. We'd love to hear a bit about how Untitled Ocean came together. I know that this piece was originally commissioned for the International Center for Photography while you worked with Joanna Lehan on it. And yeah, I'd love to hear a bit about how that conversation occurred between you and Joanna and how the resulting piece emerged.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me for this
My pleasure.
wonderful exhibition, and it's great to be here. So, as you know, I'm Turkish, and I've been doing projects in Iraq border, Syria border since the late 90s, especially focusing on the Kurdish problem, but also Iraq war. Obviously, it affected the overall territory. So I did many research trips. I realized many projects, and in 2012, actually, I was going to Iraq border. There was a small village in Iraqi-Turkish border called Roboski. Maybe you heard about it, Roboski massacre. Turkish airplanes thought that border crossing smugglers were terrorists, and they launched an aerial attack and killed 34 villagers. So the whole region, actually the borders are very artificial. As you may know, those borders today, what we call it, Syria, Iraq, Turkey, were drawn series of international games, essentially, right? French, British mostly, but Americans over the years, and I always consider this region as a kind of a transitionary region. So if you go to northern Syria, and then you go to the Turkish border, and people are relatives. Actually, in religious holidays, they cross the border, right? The governments make border crossing easier. That's similar to Iraq. So all these people has relatives, and they do border crossing and smuggling. So I was there in 2012, and the situation in Turkey got really worse because the peace process between the Turkish state and PKK, which is the Kurdish guerrilla group, collapsed. And when I was there, because the reason that it collapsed, PKK, which is YPG, is the Syrian arm, they moved in northern Syria to create an autonomous region. So for Turkey, that was unacceptable. So when I was there, the whole area was super tense. So I was doing documentation. Like, of course, I was going to Roboski, but back of my mind, the situation in Syria was escalating, and I did some documentation looking at the Syria. At the time, it was much more peaceful. Things were brewing, but there wasn't an all-out war. So when so this is 5 years forward, Joanna called me because she was considering these images, the circulation of images online, especially Aylan Kurdi's images. As you know, this Syrian Kurdish baby was essentially beached, and that was the photograph was taken, and that was one of the most circulated photographs all times. I think it hits some sort of kind of humane nerve or something like that, that people felt that not only sharing, but also a kind of a performative gesture. A lot of artworks and a lot of events and performances were staged, including IYB, right? So there are so many artists, so many groups, so many people. Some of them are very sappy, emotional. Some of them are so you see, it's like there is a variety of things that are happening. So as a person from Middle East, and I don't know how many of you from that area, but we are cursed to watch the news and read the Twitter, and every day we are cursed to be unhappy. So you wake up, you read another bad news. That's part of the reality. So unfortunately now that I read the Turkish news first, or Middle Eastern news, then I look at the New York Times and I was like, American news. So I'm sorry that now we are all kind of like in this game. But the problem, of course, in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, America played a big role, right? So there is a distance. When we look from here, there is a distance that we look to things. And I have that distance too. I'm not just saying, even though I'm from there, it doesn't matter that I cannot represent anybody. I don't represent Syrian people, right? I don't represent the people who are victims. So my question was, when Joanna asked me to think about this show, like, how do I approach a subject matter that was so intense and so contentious? And if I raise a point right now, I believe that there will be 5 counter arguments, right? Everybody has an opinion about the region. And a lot of sectarian divides, a lot of political antagonisms. So how do I approach something that has some sort of a meaningful grasp to the subject matter? So of course, I think about victim a lot. What is victim? Who's victim? When victim becomes victim, right? So I was, of course, when you talk about victim, now I'm talking about the representation of the victim, right? Who represents the victim and how? So if you look at the media, there are specialists, there are TV anchors, there are media intellectuals. There's Middle Eastern analysts. They talk about Syrian people, Turkish people, Kurdish people, right? They represent constantly, they use a kind of a mechanism. It's kind of a joke in a way. And Deleuze writes about this, they call them TV buffoons, right? In '77 there was an interview, and François Laruelle, I was reading the general theory of the victim. And he talks about this media intellectuals, how they take the role of nobody gives them the role, but they take it and they start representing them. So for me, that was the question. Like what is the mechanisms of the representation? What kind of collisions happens when we represent things? Because victim is represented and also victim as a person. So photographic apparatus or videographic apparatus, in a way that when you are taking it, you have an ethical relationship with the subject, right? You are there looking at it. Like when I was taking that refugee kid in Istanbul, so there is this, my partner was really angry at me, right? Because I didn't help, right? So this is this ethical, but as a photographer, you face that ethical dilemma. You are gonna help somebody? Am I qualified to help, first of all? What does it mean that I'm helping? Right, there are so many things that happen. Sorry, I'm a professor, so I talk a lot, so I apologize.
I'm fascinated, so you have me hooked. I think I want to catch something or sort of paraphrase something that you said, because I think you made an interesting sort of a scaling of this idea of sharing, helping, or being the advocate or agent. So if there's like this news persona that is the agent of information, like the self-appointed expert who disseminates the information, it's interesting to think about us, yourself as an artist, each of us as social media posters, as also nominating ourselves as agents. Like, I'm going to share this information, I'm going to post it. I've nominated myself to be the poster of this information, so now I am just like the micro expert to atomize it out on the internet. I'd love to hear more about some of the imagery that you've selected to include within the piece. I know some of it was something that you had documented yourself around the border. Some of that imagery is fabricated, sort of 3D renderings, and then you have that juxtaposed with some image search results. Could you talk about how you curated the imagery within the piece?
Yeah, so there are 3 layers. I think there are 4 layers. One layer, of course, is limestone powder. So, right? It started as a kind of a metaphorical, like, relationship. Limestone, like, what is sea? When you look at the sea, there are seashells, right? Those seashells are like essentially calcium. And the bones, like human bones or fish bones, everything kind of merges together. This remnants of living entities sink at the bottom of ocean. And then that is the limestone in a way, right? There's this calcification happens. And also the topographic aspect of it. So, but eventually what happened for me, that images are not perfect, right? Images are crumbled. So that's what I wanted to do. Images shouldn't look like as if these are like TV. So I didn't want to recreate this kind of like circulation. I want to break that. Of course, 3 layers. One of them is the keywords, the search. What am I going to search? Because it becomes very controversial. If I search, say, Erdogan and refugees, what do I get? Or Senator McCain and Syrian refugees. When you search that, you get all this ISIS. Like, you see, there are so many memes that happens. Like, people are really angry at Senator McCain, especially from the Middle East, because these people, just like what they did in Afghanistan with Taliban, helped Taliban to overcome Soviets in the 80s, but created the results, what we know as today's Afghanistan, right? It ruined the country. So this foreign intervention ruins the country. So what kind of like a search that I'm going to do and then depict that. So it changed the subject matter a little bit. So I did a lot of tests, and then we were discussing with Joanna, but because Joanna wanted to concentrate on the refugee, the image themselves, right? Because the political question suddenly like goes very like tangential. Of course, it is all related, that kind of circulation. But then I realized that this Ai Weiwei, all these like this good-heartedness that bothered me. Really, like I'm in that sense, I am a Nietzschean, right? I hate good people. I don't want to be good person. I imagine an environment that nobody should be good, right? So that that means we don't need to be good. Everything's okay, right? So goodness is a problem. And all these good-hearted people bothers me because they do something and then they stop. No commitment. An artist, I think in my opinion, artist is the one that who's committed. Right? Artist is the one that who's clear and what they are doing. So I want to kind of like deal with that kind of ambiguity of being good or objective or distant or close.
That's a great, I think, transition for question for the both of you, which is, like, what is the role of an artist within social discourse, and what is to you, what is the clarity that can be put on that's the constant that's always going to operate? I totally feel the same sentiment where after last year's election, it was like everyone was posting about all the charitable donations that they donated to, like, look, I did my good thing. Am I dismissed now? You know, so I know that the role of the artist is something that is a more prolonged engagement. So I'd love to hear more about, from both of you, what your thoughts are on the role of the artist as a propagator of social discourse.
Well, I think one of the first pieces I did in New York was about homelessness, and I was accused of aestheticizing a very serious situation. And now we have a similar kind of censorship, let's say, with the Dana Schutz painting event, Omar Fest, Chinatown. So it almost seems like whatever you have to do as an artist, you just have to go out and do it. I think otherwise somebody's going to stop you at every turn. I mean, you have to assume, if you really believe in what you're doing, you have to go out and do it and take the consequences, whatever those things happen to be, and hopefully you're doing it from a perspective of thinking that what you're doing is valuable in some way.
Yeah, I think, what's my role as an artist, right? So obviously I am not that kind of a good-hearted, I don't want to create a kind of a good,
You're a bad
yes,
person.
but I want to, so what is a society, right? I asked this question, because I do these things too, ACLU, okay, of course I have to pay for, like, right, like you feel like obligated, and then everybody
Fill out the
pays, and
checkbook.
everybody posts, and then like Muslim ban, I am like ex-Muslim, non-Muslim, so I have to be part of this. My family will be banned, right? Like all these things that plays into, but at the same time, as an artist, I feel like my goal is to raise voice against society. Like, because society is itself a problem, right? A pathology, the way that what brings society together, because, and also, in part, I trained as a sociologist. So like, of course, when you look at society, and any kind of society, I look at like hierarchies and gender segregation and like social inequalities. I see all these problems. And I see this historical, like a continuous, like oppression. And of course, like as an artist, my goal is not to help society. My goal is to destroy it, such a way that a new possibility can emerge. Of course, this is like, I am just we as artists, very small group of people, and that our actions are very small, but these gestures are important. It creates an imaginary realm that is like, it poses a question, the possibility that the society shouldn't exist as such, like evangelical society or Sunni Turkish society or this majority. Majorities shouldn't exist. That's how I feel.
I'm thinking, though, if you think about Occupy Wall Street, for example, which was a huge group of people who a percentage of those people were artists who generated a lot of excitement in a neighborhood, and that went on for quite a long time. And I think it was really a positive thing that was, so somehow in numbers, and if you can hit the right tone and the right issue, and I think you can actually move things forward. I have to believe in something, sorry.
No, I believe, but as an artist, like I think that I posed that question as an activist, as a political party. I believe, let's say, we have to reimagine political parties. A lot of people think about this right now, right? And people write about it. But this is not an art project. Establishing a political party and running an organization is not an art project. It's a social project that needs to be done in a manner, a discipline that an artist cannot do, right? An artist is good at things that they do, because I believe this. I think it has to happen both ways, right? Yeah. There's one aspect of it: we organize, we gather, we assemble, we democratize. On the one hand, we destroy it, and then we question it, we re-examine it, so that it is not crystallizing. It always flows. So that's how I feel artist's role is to eliminate crystallization in society.
Moving faster than the critics.
So part of this exhibition on my end came about due to a lot of just the informational fatigue we've experienced this last year. I'm sure a lot of people are just kind of wiped out from trying to decipher what's real news, what's fake news, what headlines are what, why does things that seem completely irrational and ridiculous, like actually this is like the society that is ours now, we must own. And then I look at both of your works, and you're each using elements of sort of like fantasy and unreal elements, or in your case maybe more absurd or ridiculous elements, to sort of find a nice blend of like a parafiction, blending both real and fabricated elements. And I wonder if parafiction is now the new normal, like as far as news go. And if you want to talk a bit about how you parse through your own information sources.
That's an interesting question, because it's something I'm struggling with a lot. And my natural tendency is to go out in my neighborhood, which is Tennessee and Massachusetts, because it tends to be really happening all over New York, and just shoot a lot of pictures. But then I thought, some documentary material, and how do I work with something like that? And so one of my ways of dealing with that has been to construct some kind of narrative that interferes with the reality that I see. And I've done some weird things in the past, like when Bush and the Iraq War was happening, I invented Operation Marmalade. I think people's cuisines were uphill digestion. And I actually cooked and served the marmalade on the street. So somehow there was something in that gesture that ended up being somewhat meaningful as a performative way. So I'm always struggling with exactly the question that my professor asked me, and I don't have a real answer.
Yeah, I mean, of course, my practice is very much situated in kind of a documentary research mode. But at the same time, I see this, of course, I wouldn't call like Twitter following a research, but let's say it's a serious research, and it is as real as going to somewhere like Iraq border, with its fictions, with its lies. Because when you talk with people, real people, there are also like a lot of conspiracies, a lot of things that you would find it fantastical. Like 2 weeks ago, I was listening some anthropologists. I was in a conference with a lot of anthropologists. And northern Turkey, there is this area essentially they are Greeks, but over the time they became extreme Turkish nationalists. But among themselves they speak a form of Old Greek. But they call themselves, if they call them Greek, they would be insulted and they would beat you. But they are Greek, they talk Greek, they can understand Greek people, but they are more nationalistic than a normal nationalistic person, Turkish person. They are Turkish fascists. So this person, the research was on them, and then how they use the conspiracies to kind of create this fantastical world so that they can be that fascistic entity, right? Because they are actually not Turkish. So I see this as a real. Like real, is it in this fantastical narrative form, which forms a community of people within a town. All of them are Greek, where one of the most strongest fascist part of the country. So that is kind of like I find this as a kind of a metaphor, like internet, right? A lot of circulations happen, these fantastical conspiracy theories.
The bubble.
People, within the bubble, they suddenly, that's a physical, the words or discourse has a physical manifestation in the body. Physical meaning that it rewires your neurons, right? You become that person. If you believe in it, I think I take belief very seriously. I don't believe in God, but belief itself is such a powerful tool and I have to believe in something in order to do something. So I want to use, in order to believe something, you have to be spiritual. So I also think about this spiritual aspect of religious aspects, because religion is a fiction from the beginning, right? How we can create as artists to have some form of a spiritual realm so that we can actually create counter narratives, which are not as crazy. So that I look at these images, those images can be assembled such a way that they are real. I mean, that's why there's 3 layers. The research is, I consider them as part, like one thing. I don't see them not real. They are all, but Godard said it long ago, right? He said, is not the cinema is not dealing with the reality. The reality is the cinema, right? Cinema itself is the real thing. Right. So we can adapt that to that kind of imagery, any kind of like 3D imagery, or yeah.
Well, I'd be curious if I know you guys have just met tonight and really just encountered each other's projects for the first time tonight. Do you have any questions for one another?
I think I'm fascinated with Israeli case because I find it very similar, right, in many aspects, because the transformation in Israel, I think last 10 years, 15 years is very much overlaps with the transformation in Turkey. And I wondered how they are responding to that transformation, because I know that there are 1 million Jews that came from ex-Soviet countries, and a lot of Israeli friends that I have who are lefties, they became very vulnerable. Suddenly demographically they are overrun. And I felt the same way in Turkey, right? Suddenly you feel like there's a force, dark force that emerged, and you're like, oh my God, we are overpowered. We cannot do anything anymore. So I felt that how, yeah.
But there are a lot of people, a lot of Israelis who are still Baptist, who are not like the people who are under residency in Iraq. But I don't think that they're doing what they're doing in the aggressive kind of way that you might find somebody who would call a lefty here. But it's more about infiltration and being part of the society. And actually, that's a question that really interests me a lot. And when we had our exhibition in New York, we organized a panel that was called, we organized a panel about friendship with a friend of ours who is a philosopher who teaches early, like Aristotle and Plato. where she asked, how do you still remain friends with somebody who doesn't agree with you? And then she went into a tirade from her point of view. And I thought that that was really interesting because she was trying to open up a conversation, and at the same time she closed it down. And then Nick, who's the philosopher, gave these definitions that Aristotle had about friendship. And it actually generated a really good conversation because everybody's on Facebook and we have these words like friend that are kind of meaningless today. We have a whole new vocabulary of meaningless words. In fact, we're living in this realm of vocabulary that means nothing anymore. So it generated a lot of discussion about this, how do you live together when you don't get along, which is basically what I saw happening in Israel when I was there, is that there were people who clearly didn't agree with each other, but they kept their points of view quiet and they managed to live side by side pretty much.
Is that the answer, keeping quiet?
It shouldn't be the answer.
Well, I think it might be nice to open up to some questions from the room. If you do have one, just raise your hand and we'll run you a mic. Come on, you've got two amazing artists from out of town, one night only, in the frontier. Yeah.
Should I ask both together or separate? So, okay, first one was, relating to, the whole topic you mentioned about, charities, victims, and, the sense of goodness and the help that comes through it. And when I was looking at your images, as in the layering, I was actually thinking of the whole designer charities that create the layering of victims. Have you... designer charities, as in, people or groups with the Messiah effect, like for lack of better words. As in they decide what is needed and they come and start helping and they create victims through that process. And then there is hierarchy between victims, as in who is better victim and who is not. So that's what I mean by layering of victims. And I see it happening, mostly through crisis, as in during the aftermath of crisis. What was your observations around that?
So it's interesting because the word Muslim, Muslim is a religious, but in Turkish, Muslim, when I say Muslim, Muslim means in Turkish victim. Because it's translated, of course, Müslüman, in Turkish we say Müslüman, which is Muslim, but when I say Muslim in Turkish, which means the victim. Don't touch the Muslim, we say, which means the person that was poor, cannot talk, cannot respond, so you have to, so it's interesting, right? Because the oppressed needs to be articulated in a victimized manner so that you legitimize the attack. So let's say ISIS or ex-Islamists, radical Islam, whatever you may call it, the narration of it is that Muslims are Muslim, which are victims, which needs to be defended. And then you have to, when it legitimizes, so there's a legitimate violence. And states, for instance, use the legitimate violence. We have police. Police is violence, right? State is violence. Law is violence because we legitimize them through the social, institutional processes, etc. So when it comes to this, I'm not talking about charity, of course, but let's say an organization like ISIS. I say organization, it sounds like, but nevertheless, it's an organization, right? They use institutional mechanisms. They institutionalize, they develop a certain discourse of victim so that they legitimize their horrific acts. So that's one of the issue, right? But as soon as you say you talk for a victim, then you also talk about the possibility of punishing the oppressor, because you need to defend the victim. So you create a kind of a legitimate, like, intention of violence, because you have to stop the oppressor. So that is, I think François Laurel is very much interested in this problem. You cannot talk victim in general, he argues. We have to talk victim in person. Who's that victim? Is that victim Harry or Jehra, right? So we have to, like, really, and what happened to that person? And victim in person and victim in general, I think charities, what they do, victim in general, oh, we are dealing with a homeless population. We are like helping the Syrian people. Like you are kind of like this rounding effect, like rounded numbers. I say when you go to East, you round more. Like how many Iraqis died? Oh, like 500,000. You see, like you round 5 digits, no problem. So anyway, you had another question.
Because it would seem through scaling numbers that that issue stretches away from the person themselves and becomes a more like anonymous or universal way of treating something, where it isn't about the impact on the person. It's much more generalized.
Yeah, sorry, so I don't do that kind of research. Sorry, I apologize. But I don't do that kind of research. But a lot of artists who actually deals with victim in person, right? They really communicate. They develop a personal relationship. There is something else happens there. Like, I think that kind of relationship, like that becomes, it's not no longer victim anymore. Like you listen, you suddenly, it's not is about victim, because victim has to be represented, whereas the person that who can speak and opens a platform, then it's a healing process starts. So you are no longer victim. So François Laurel say that victim, there are 2 kinds of victim. One kind of victim is Aylan Kurdi, lies down, dead, paralyzed, cannot move, cannot speak. And then the other one is the image of Christ, who's standing up, ready to resist. That is no longer, because he's not dead, he's going to resurface, come back with vengeance, right? Like there's a possibility of resisting that vital energy. That victim is not animal, it's vital. But why we are separating this animal? You see what I mean? It creates, I think he questions that humanity aspect of it. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say it establishes a polarity. And once you establish that polarity, you already have fighting sides. You know.
Are there any other questions? Mina?
Yeah, I have a very quick second question. It's for both of you, or probably all of us. We, as in with election, we have entered this new era of not believing any news anymore, and whereas artists are, as you said, trying to not take over, but trying to fill in the gaps in journalism, being a watchdog, being critic, and raising questions. So, how should we respond to this particular notion of not believing any news, like good or bad or anyone?
The comedians are coming up with the best news.
I am still like a kind of modernist in the sense that I want to believe in things, right? I want to believe, let's say, social justice. I want to believe secular democracy. I want to believe institutions. I want to believe good journalism. Right? I want to believe that there are people that who can do those things and provide. So if I don't, this cynical, like, oh, we don't believe anything, I don't do that. For instance, I have convictions. But sometimes those convictions are not right. Of course, there's a possibility, because when you're convicted, you have convictions, then you're high-strung, or you're thick-headed, or I don't know. But nevertheless, this antagonisms is the only position, like democratic antagonisms. I think we do this all the time, like in our classes, in our assemblies, people oppose to each other. These are the positions that that can be moments of like creating some truth. Yeah, I don't want to say that I don't believe in truth.
I wonder if truth-telling has like a economic relationship where the closer you are to monies, the less likely you are to be swayed to twist the truth. Whereas artists, unfortunately, like don't necessarily start with the money, so we have the most space and liberty to be truth tellers because no one's paying us to do otherwise. You know. That's my answer.
I remember when the Iraq War broke out, I was fed up with the news and I started reading a blog by somebody named Riverbend. And this blog was amazing. It was actually published as a book afterwards. But basically what she did was describe her life and, you know, having no electricity, trying to buy tomatoes, but if there were no tomatoes, it was because they were bombing in the north. And so you got a real personal perspective on what the war looked like, not from the official kind of news media. And I think that that kind of personal, you know, writing really provides a completely different perspective from what we get through the official channels.
Yeah.
Hi. So my question's kind of similar. I had to write it down on my phone as I was gathering thoughts. So in this age that feels very post-truth, like in the wake of the election, something that has seemed to be true for me is that I've seen it, or I've interpreted it to be driven a lot more by affect and especially anger. This doesn't relate necessarily to your pieces, but I mean just the post-election situation in the U.S. So what do you think is the role of the artist in playing or dealing with affect and emotion, kind of in this system in which rationality seems to have failed us in providing a solution or remedying stuff? And yeah, how do you think art can help us maybe manipulate affect or toward social change?
I mean, this is a fantastic question,
Yeah,
of course.
really.
So
If I knew I'd be doing it.
so I am one of the organizers of Gezi in New York. We gathered like 3,000 to 4,000 people when there was Istanbul Gezi protest. We organized in New York, and like a lot of conferences, talks, etc. And one of the talks we did is Michael Hart, and we were talking about like what should we do next, right? We always like come to the point that okay, we are gathering, we are like okay, lovely, and then we realized that actually we were doing what we should do next, right? Because the idea of assembly, the idea of gathering, is already creating a form of subjectivity. Is not about the social change that there's an audience. It is our bodies transforming. So like I feel like an artist's job is to, I'm not just talking about myself, and there are a lot of different artists and they do a lot of amazing work. The art object, what it does is to gather people. It's a form, it's a democratic space where you can, I mean, this is the idea of art, right? You gather around and then you look at it, you share a moment together. And then I think about love a lot, instead of hate or instead of like, and Alain Badiou talks about this too, but the commune, what makes us together. It is not an institutional pressure, this or that. We gather because we love. We love each other. We love our countries. We love our cities. And we want to react. And love is, he says, that the basic form of institutional, like being lovers. Two persons comes together without being one, still two, form an institution. I'm not talking about marriage institution, but an institution that two persons can be together and that can be enlarged into a larger communal area. So like an art does that, in my opinion, when you put an object. It brings people, yeah.
I have a question about living here, which is since the Trump agenda, have people gathered in protests and gone to Washington and all of these kinds of things? Because in New York there's refusefascism.org, which might be here as well. There are a lot of different organizations that meet and have been meeting on a regular basis. So I'm just curious what it looks like community-wise here.
There's quite a few. In fact, I think I see some people here who may be involved and have shown up at some things. Would you guys like to share with our guests?
Do you mean in the Twin Cities or
Yeah.
at McAllister or?
I think both, yeah.
Well, I guess there's some action happening at McAllister. I guess the difficulty for us is being very overscheduled, stuff like that. But in the Twin Cities, I'm part of a bunch of socialist organizing personnel. I don't know about other people.
Hi. I just wanted to mention one because it's recent. Maybe some people want to join. But Sam Gold, who runs Beyond Repair, which is it's like a self-publishing site where anybody can show up and print things and from political items. And it's situated at the, what's it called? Midtown Market, yeah. So it's like this, there's restaurants and it's in the heart of South Minneapolis, so it involves a very diverse community, and lots of artists have done projects through them. But they've started this municipalism group that's met maybe 3 times, and they're trying to think of ways to organize that deconstruct hierarchies of ways of doing things traditionally. So, and it's based on things that have been done in Spain that are similar as ways to organize people. It was used mainly for rent control and affordability and rents and stuff like that. Anyway, so if you guys want to join, go to Beyond Repair.
I'll also just say that, November 7th was an election here, and and we have 2 people who were elected in Minneapolis who are artists. So talking about this, politicians aren't artists, or I know a lot of artists who have tried to run for office as like a performance piece or something. But like Jeremiah Ellison and Andrea Jenkins, who's a poet. So it's kind of it's a nice gesture. Hopefully, it also will sort of impact. And I think that the council members actually have more impact than the mayor, anyway.
I actually have a little more lighthearted of a question. So I'm just curious, do you always create because there is a question to be asked or something to be said, or do you ever find yourself creating and then realizing that it relates to something that you do have a question about or that is relevant to you?
You mean you start off doing one thing and you end up in a different track or something?
Yeah, I guess so. I guess really the question is are you creating your art because there's a question that you need to answer, or that there's a question that's being asked, or something you need to say, or do you sometimes create because you want to create and then there ends up nothing being said?
Well, all right, I torture myself a lot, so I like to figure things out before I really, truly launch into something. So I spend a lot of time working out an idea in a way that I think that it's going to work. And then usually a lot of things happen along the way, and it shifts and morphs, and other things tangential show up at the same time. And in the meantime, not to drive myself totally nuts, I draw and sometimes make short videos and things like that. But usually I have something that's a bigger project that I'm trying to figure out, and that sort of is the research-based thing that I'm working on. And it doesn't always work out.
Hi, this question is for Perry. Thanks for speaking with us. I'm interested to hear you reflect on the extraordinary danger of giving platform to two voices, you call them from opposing sides, two voices that erase indigenous, namely Palestinian history.
The danger of not, in other words, not having the Palestinian story there?
Not necessarily. Giving platform to two voices that actively erase indigenous history, be it the absence of another voice or just giving those voices in particular the platform.
Well, okay, that's a really good question, and it bothered me from the start. We went there, really the intention was to look at this from the point of view of siblings who have opposing political views, and the idea was to question this relationship in terms of how people manage to get around. In other words, is it always about silence? So it was more almost a sociological family study, let's say. And we hadn't even really thought about this in terms of Palestine because we knew these two Israelis, and it was much more a direct relationship with them. But the question you ask is completely pertinent because when we got back to New York and we had only one side of the story, we weren't really willing to show the work. And it took Trump to kind of bring us back to that question of how do opposing political views get along. But that doesn't really address your question, which we haven't really addressed, which is giving voice to the other side. And I guess that was because that was never the intention when we began it. So I'll confess that it bothers me, but that's the way it stands.
Any other questions? Well, without further questions, I want to thank our guests for joining us here in Minneapolis tonight, for your time participating in this conversation this evening. And I would encourage all of you to continue to talk to the artists after we dismiss this talk, to pop back in the gallery and revisit the work again. And thank you all for your time and good questions this evening.
And thank you, Jara, for
Thank
inviting
you.
us.
My absolute
Really,
pleasure. Yeah.
it's a beautiful installation as well.
Thanks much.